Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. If you are one of the majority of Americans tired of voting for the lesser of two evils, and if you are one of the majority of Americans who feels we need more choices on the ballot, we feel two parties are too few, and talk about the dysfunction of our current system and how we can fix it. Now, we entered the most recent election cycle with a rematch between two candidates 70% of Americans said they didn't want to see on the ballot. And a poll conducted by FairVote said that sentiment ticked up, with only about half of Americans not liking their choices on the ballot by Election Day. So we went from an F to an F. Wonderful job. Now, we're going to dive into that poll, discuss the state of voter dissatisfaction, and most importantly, what we can do about it. But first, I need to introduce a very special guest today. Sean is out sick, and so I have asked Will Mantell, Director of Communications at FairVote, to join me. Will, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
And before we get started, I know about FairVote, Sean knows about FairVote. Can you tell the listener what FairVote is and what you do over there?
We are a nonpartisan organization seeking better elections and representation. We are a research and advocacy organization. We have been around and beating the drum for ranked choice voting and proportional representation since 1992, before it was cool.
Yeah, I think I told you when we first met that I've been a FairVote fanboy for years. And when I started my electoral reform journey back in 2018, which is small when you think about FairVote's history, FairVote was one of the first sites I found because I thought I was the only one. And I love the resources y'all put out. And I'm psyched that you're here to talk with us today. So before we get into the subject at hand, I prepared a game for us. Sean's not here, so we're going to play a game called Where's Sean? Yeah, okay, so there's an easy part to this game, Will, and there's a hard part. The easy part is you don't have to guess the right answer. So that's the easy part. Now the hard part to this, Will, is that you have to guess the answer that our listeners believe sounds the most true. So not true, but sounds the most true. And we're going to do this via a poll run by Ranked Choice, Will. So we're not going to do any first past the post polling here.
Love it.
And you've got to determine what the consensus answer is. So here we go. You ready?
Sure.
Okay, number one, Will. Sean is in the hospital after eating too many Tide Pods. It's number one. Okay. Do number two. Sean is in Tennessee watching the migration of the southern leopard frog, which happens to be making its way through Tennessee right at this moment. And then number three, Sean is awaiting trial in Philadelphia for allegedly looting a Walgreens during Sunday's Super Bowl celebration. So, one, Tide Pods, two, observing the migration of the southern leopard frog, or three, awaiting trial in Philadelphia. Sean is either a moron, a frog enthusiast, or a felon. Which do you think listeners will feel is most true?
Well, I get to rank, right?
It's a rank, man. Yeah, it's a rank.
Nice.
Rank it in order of preference, even.
So I think the most likely is that he is observing the migration of the frog that we've all definitely heard of before.
Yeah, of course.
I think option number two, or my second choice, is that he is in Philly. Although I think maybe he would have gone a little bit later and he'd be at the parade today. And then I'm very hopeful that he's not in the hospital. And I'm also very hopeful that he's not ingesting Tide Pods at this point in time. So that's going to be my 1, 2, 3. I'm going to say frogs, birds, Tide.
I think that's a very flattering assessment. I do. So let's jump into the poll that you all released back in December. And this is one that Sean and I talked about right when it was released, because it showed that nearly half of voters, so 47%, felt they were voting for the lesser of two evils in at least one election, which begs the question, partially, who are the remaining 53%? But I'd like you to just tell the listener a little bit about that poll.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a poll, I believe about 1,000 voters. It was conducted shortly after the election, so it was fresh on people's mind. And what it does is it gives us another data point, and it tells the story of voters who are unhappy with their choices on the ballot. And we have a lot of data points showing that voters are frustrated with our democracy. We have a lot of data points showing that voters want more choices on the ballot. But this one is very stark. These are people who are saying, I didn't vote in a way that made me feel positive. I voted in a way that was just minimizing the negative. So it's kind of coming at an interesting time and an interesting election. You talked about the election starting, the presidential election in 2024, starting with these two really unpopular candidates in Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And you had a really high number of these kind of quote unquote double haters who disliked both of them. That number fell a bit when Harris replaced Biden on the ticket, and kind of as we got closer to the election, and people tended to move more into partisan camps. But still, really a significant number of voters who are feeling unhappy. And so I think it is just another data point validating and sort of giving more juice to the need for reforms that allow voters to have more choices. And what's more American than having more choices?
100%. And I think what I found really interesting about that poll was the fact that this sentiment was more or less evenly spread across Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Democrats and independents were a little more dissatisfied than Republicans, but Republicans were the lowest in terms of dissatisfaction at 43%. So it's not like it's restricted to one partisan group, right?
Yeah, everyone's unhappy. Yay.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think what it tells us is there are large portions of every voting bloc that you would think of that are unhappy with their choices and that want and could be served by reforms that give us more choices.
And so when you dig into the reasons for dissatisfaction, what do they say?
I think that poll was just kind of a single question
Yeah.
about folks voting for the lesser of two evils, but we do see regular polls coming out about how voters feel about democracy and how voters feel about the political system. I think one of the things that has really stood out to us at FairVote is this poll that came out last year, where 85% of Americans who were polled said that politicians don't care about what people like them think. And so there's this real disconnect and real breakdown of what our political system is supposed to be, right? Like our political system, our democratic system is we elect the politicians, they are responsive to our needs, and then if they do that, we reelect them, and if not, we throw them out of office. And when you have a vast majority saying that's broken down, saying actually the people who are representing me like don't really listen to what I think, even though probably a lot of them voted for that person or voted for some of those people. Again, I think that speaks to just a feeling that the incentives are broken, and kind of like the basic pillar of democracy, which is just representation for your wants and needs, is not working.
Yeah, there's an interesting data point that I pulled out of exit polling in the most recent election. And what you saw was about a third of voters weren't voting for a candidate per se. There was a percentage of Trump voters that were voting against Harris and vice versa for Harris. And when you broke down the total number of people voting for either Trump or Harris, you had somewhere in the neighborhood of like 30% for Trump. And I want to say like maybe 20, 25% for Harris. I don't know the exact number there. But it definitely goes to show that people aren't necessarily positive about their choices. In a lot of cases, they're voting to do less harm. And one of the other things I've observed, and I'm curious if you have any data or any insights into this, but it doesn't seem to have hurt voter participation yet. I don't know if that continues forever, but from what I've seen, voter turnout has pretty much remained consistent.
I think just because people are unhappy with their choices doesn't mean that people aren't voting. But I also think that that's not healthy for our democracy, right? Like, if the sole focus of our politics is to keep the other side out, and that starts to leak into other parts of society and how we interact with people who are different from us or who have different politics from us, then we're in real trouble. So, the short answer to your question, not much very obvious impact on voter turnout yet, but it's not positive for our democracy, and we'll see if that changes too. That voter turnout issue.
Yeah, I think you make a good point too, which is just because people are negative about the state of affairs or negative about the people in office doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to vote. I
Yeah,
mean, during the Troubles, Northern Ireland had a very well functioning democracy, but people were obviously not getting along politically or otherwise. So, you also at FairVote, you've compiled a lot of data on different states and municipalities that are using alternative voting methods, right? So ranked choice voting probably being the most popular. Do you see any difference in terms of their level of satisfaction with those elections and with their candidates than the country at large?
yeah. I mean, you do see really high levels of satisfaction with ranked choice voting, and basically when people get to use it, they like it. I could sort of cite poll numbers all day, but we had a couple of good ones come out of San Francisco, the California Bay Area recently, that has been using it for 2 decades now. And 7 out of 10 voters said they like the system, they want to keep it, or they even want to grow it to more elections. In Utah, about 9 out of 10 said they were satisfied. And one of the things that was super interesting to us was about 7 out of 10 said, in a ranked choice race, I'm actually more likely to vote for my favorite candidate than in our traditional pick one elections. And that's a really good data point for showing how voters are actually interacting with the ability to rank more than one candidate and to sort of go beyond this lesser of two evils that you and I have been talking about.
That brings up another question, which is, fair vote's been around a while. You're living and breathing this every day. And we're also coming off an election cycle where four different and possibly more, but four that I know of, four different statewide referendums to change the system of elections failed at the ballot box, and Alaska preserved top four voting by a hair. Why, when voter dissatisfaction is at such a high level, is this such a tough sell?
I think there are a few answers to that. One is just it is really hard to break through with an issue that is new on a crowded ballot. And it's easier for voters, and it makes sense to me as a voter too, to revert to no if you're not totally sold, if you're not totally sure that something is the right way forward. And kind of just as an anecdote, if you look at the Colorado ballot, and that was one of the states where ranked choice voting and open primaries were on the ballot and it lost, um, you vote for your president, you vote for state rep, you vote for state senate, you vote for your member of Congress, you vote whether to retain your judges or not. And then you read through 14 statewide ballot measures, and the 14th one is a big, dense paragraph asking if you want to move to top four primaries in ranked choice voting. So it's kind of an uphill battle to assume that people are going to get all the way there and not be too cranky and on that 14th question say, yeah, I'm going to do this, instead of just saying, I'm not really sure, or I have reasons to not be sure, or I'm tired of reading through these measures, I'm just going to vote no. I think the other thing that we saw, and again, voters are working with limited and kind of imperfect information, and this was probably not the focus of most voters in filling out their ballot. They're thinking about the presidential race. That's taking up lots and lots of space, as you and I both recall. In most states, the sort of state party infrastructure, so like the state Democratic Party or the state Republican Party, came out and came out pretty hard against these ballot measures. And it's not because ranked choice voting and open primaries don't work. It's because ranked choice voting and open primaries do work. And because they're a challenge to the status quo. And whether or not these parties or candidates would still be able to do quite well with ranked choice voting or open primaries, you're asking them to change. You're saying, we know that you've built power in a certain way. We know that you know how to win elections a certain way. We know that you know the playbook, and we want to change it in a way that's going to ask you to talk to more voters, in a way that's going to ask you to be more responsive to voters. And so a lot of these groups came out against it, and they have decades of trust built up. They have decades of grassroots infrastructure, and if they are putting their card on the door that says vote for Kamala Harris and vote for the Democrats down the line. And by the way, also vote against Proposition 131 or vice versa, vote for Trump and vote for your Republican representative. It's totally understandable that a lot of voters would take that cue. So I think it's tough, and most of those ballot measures at the statewide level, not just ranked choice voting and open primaries, but most of the democracy reform ones. There are a bunch of gerrymandering ballot measures that unfortunately went down. Also struggled last year.
Yeah.
I will say we did have some big wins at the city level. I think those conversations may have gone better for a couple of reasons. I think one is there was just an ability to have more grassroots and kind of more one-on-one conversations, to knock on doors and say, hey, this is what ranked choice voting is. This is how it gives you more power. You should think about voting yes. And that's going to be something that's easier to do in a smaller location, and also harder to do in some of the vote by mail states like Oregon and Colorado that voted on ranked choice voting and open primaries. And I also think those races are less partisan. And so you might say, okay, I think that my city council can do a better job of listening to voters, and I'd like to see some change. And I'm not super worried that, like, I'm a Democrat and it's going to elect all Republicans, or I'm a Republican and it's going to elect all Democrats. All that being said, I think mixed results for sure. But I do think that the city wins are a bright spot, and an area of continued momentum for ranked choice voting and election reform at large.
Yeah, I think it's tough. So we're in an environment of just peak distrust.
Yeah,
And so I think it is very difficult to sell anything on a large scale, but I would agree with you, starting small is a little easier, starting at the municipal level. Do you think that's kind of the key?
I think it's a key part of the strategy. I think it's a bit all of the above, and I don't want to write anything off, and I don't think we should write anything off. And I think the other thing that's kind of interesting is, like, New York City is a city that uses ranked choice voting, but New York City, if it were a state, would be bigger than, I don't know, half the states. Like, that's a big population to sell on election reform. I do think we saw some really promising signs that where ranked choice voting was in use, voters were more likely to vote for it. We saw that in a couple places in Oregon where that statewide ballot measure failed, but places like Portland and Benton County voted for it, which have been using ranked choice voting, or which just started using ranked choice voting more recently. Um, I think the other thing is we kind of talked about those polls earlier. um, this is something, when you have a ballot in front of you and when you get to realize, oh, I get to pick my real first choice, and then, yeah, I'm going to pick a couple backup choices too. It's something that is easy, it's something that is empowering. And so the short answer is, I don't want to say that it always has to be city to bigger city to state. But I do think that's one good way of doing things.
And to get back to something you said before too, which I think is important, is whatever you're doing, I think it's important to really have a grassroots
Yeah.
movement behind you. One of the things that I really like about Rank the Vote, which is, for the listener, if you're unaware, an organization that supports ranked choice voting movements nationwide, is that they really focus on supporting organizations at the state level. So they don't want to like take over, they don't want to run a ballot initiative. They effectively want to give folks on a state by state basis a playbook they can use to build their own grassroots movement. And I think that that's a lot more powerful, because I think one of the things I observed about the ballot initiatives, again, we're talking like Colorado, Nevada, and Arizona specifically, I don't know so much about the one in Idaho, there didn't appear to be that same level of grassroots support. Correct me if I'm wrong here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say as a counterpoint, DC is a really good example.
Okay.
And DC not only passed their ballot measure, but they passed it overwhelmingly. 73%. They won every one of the city's 8 wards, which are, I'm down in DC, which are our council districts essentially. They won every single precinct, which is, I mean, literally as good as you can get. But there were kind of a couple interesting things in DC. The first is there was a sort of steadily building grassroots movement over the last several years. And so there were groups that started working on this in 2018 and 2019 and kind of familiarizing people and softening the ground, so to speak. And then there was kind of an effort in the city council in 2021. And so you got some of those chattering class, like Politico types, even though they were not necessarily fans, you got them more familiar and kind of more comfortable with the idea. And so that long runway, I think, certainly helpful in getting the city and getting voters ready. I think again, speaking to the grassroots and those direct touches, one of the things that we heard was the DC campaign sent door knockers to some neighborhoods east of the Anacostia River. That's a lower income area and one that tends to have sort of less political power and is often kind of neglected by candidates. And so they were knocking on doors and talking to voters about why ranked choice voting and why opening primaries to independent voters, and that was the combination here, would make politicians actually work harder for their votes and give politicians an incentive to come and actually talk to them. And not only did that message break through, but they heard several times, I've lived here for 20 or 30 years. You're the first person who showed up on my door. So there's a value to that grassroots touch, and it's also underscoring the actual message of the need. Again, we talked about this earlier of like politicians to be more responsive and to connect more to voters and what they're asking for. And then even the just kind of very simple touch, the DC campaign, and I was happy to be one of them, but the DC campaign set up volunteers at every precinct in the city. And as voters walked in, there was that kind of last one on one touch. And sometimes it was just vote yes on Initiative 83, and sometimes it was a conversation. But I was surprised by how many substantive conversations that I had. And I hope that I swayed a few voters, although I didn't really need to because, again, it won 73 to 27. But, you know, it was an opportunity for folks to say, hey, what's going to be the real impact of this? Or, like, I read that this may hurt this party or help this party. What's the deal with that? And I think creating that space and ideally creating it earlier with that kind of grassroots building and momentum building is super helpful. But creating any version of that space, I think, is key for anything that's new. And folks just aren't used to ranked choice voting for the most part, and folks just aren't used to like very in-depth conversations about our primaries either.
I'm super curious in those door knocking efforts.
Yeah,
How many of those folks needed an explanation on what ranked choice voting was, and how many people were already aware of it?
I think it's a good question. I think probably it was a lot of folks needed a significant majority needed
Mhm.
an explanation early on. But the campaign was really good about trying to do lots of touches. And that's lots of door knocks, that's lots of mail, that's, you know, work in the media as well. And so my understanding was as you got closer and closer to the election, voters were getting more familiar and voters were getting more comfortable with it.
I want to pivot for a little bit and kind of look at it because we've been talking a lot about the kind of local level, which I really like, and I want to get back to it. FairVote's been a big proponent of the Fair Rep Act,
Yeah.
right, which has been introduced in the last two sessions of Congress. Which, if you made it this far in the episode, you probably already know what it is. I'm going to explain it anyway, which is it changes the congressional map from single member districts to multi-member districts, where seats in Congress are awarded according to a party's share of the popular vote. And so it allows for a much better partisan uh, representation of the electorate, also makes room for new parties to form. I'd love to hear as much as you can tell me about what the process was like advocating for that legislation and then ultimately getting it on the floor of the House.
So I think what is very exciting is the Fair Representation Act has two great co-sponsors who really care about this work and who have been involved in this work for longer than they've been in Congress. And so Don Beyer is the lead sponsor. He is from Northern Virginia and has been active in thinking about how to improve our democracy and improve our elections. I think well before he came to office, and his home city of Arlington is another one that's adopted ranked choice voting and is really kind of on the cutting edge of different conversations about how you improve representation. Jamie Raskin is the kind of lead co-sponsor of the Fair Representation Act and served on FairVote's board when he was a Maryland state rep in 2000 or 2005 or 2010.
Okay.
So these conversations have been happening for a long time, and we're lucky to have leaders in Congress who kind of see the value of it and are starting those conversations at the congressional level. I think exciting for us, there are also some new efforts to advance proportional representation and election reforms in Congress. Jared Golden, who's a congressman from Maine, and Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, who's a congresswoman from southern Washington state, have introduced a bill. It's Congress, so it's a bill for a committee, but a bill
Yes.
for a select committee to study different reforms like proportional representation and like ranked choice voting as well. And what's kind of exciting about that and kind of connects back to Beyer and Raskin is Jared Golden knows about ranked choice voting because Jared Golden has been elected with ranked choice voting 3 or 4 times now. And he lives in Maine and he's voted with ranked choice voting and sees value in that kind of structural reform on a larger scale. And then I will briefly mention we saw for the first time Portland, Oregon use this proportional form of ranked choice voting, combining multi member districts with ranked choice voting in electing their city council. And they did that just this past November. And it's obviously still very early. Those city councilors, the new mayor who was elected with ranked choice voting as well, were sworn in, a month and a half ago. But there are a couple of very exciting things. First, Portland is the largest city in the U.S. to use proportional representation. Second, it is that exact kind of multi-member district and ranked choice voting model that we talk about with the Fair Representation Act. And third, sort of the promise of proportional representation is that everyone is represented and you have a Congress or you have a council or whatever it is that looks like the city. And just in terms of that demographic representation, the Portland City Council is kind of amazing. Like they have renters, they have homeowners, they have people from age 28 to 70. They have people who are endorsed by the Democratic Socialists. They have people who are endorsed by the Chamber of Commerce. They have pro business, they have pro union, they have the largest number of women they've ever had. They have racial representation that mirrors the demographics of the city. So, again, we'll see how that keeps moving. But we do have this very clear example starting to develop of proportional representation delivering exactly what it's supposed to deliver.
Honestly, I think the only obstacle to proportional representation is that it's a mouthful. It's ranked choice voting, you can explain very easily. Proportional
Yeah.
representation, you kind of get into the math, and that's where you lose people. One of the most interesting things I have seen is the rise of a state level movement for proportional representation, the Pro Rep Coalition out of California. I don't know if
Mhm.
there are any others, but what I find really interesting is you've got this enormous state, tons of voters. If that state by itself were to go proportional, you would open up room for minor parties to really start to gain some traction. Or at the very least, again, for the major parties to become more responsive to a broader set of constituents than just their base, which I found really interesting. And I almost feel in a lot of ways, based on what you're telling me, that's a model a lot of people can repeat in their state.
Yeah, no, that's super exciting. And one of the things that we often see is folks will come to the ranked choice voting movement or will come to the election reform movement here having heard about ranked choice voting, which has value in and of itself, and giving voters more choices and addressing the spoiler effect and delivering majority winners. And I could keep going if you
Yeah.
want, but I've been
You're preaching to the choir, man. Yeah.
yes, yes, yes. But then they also learn about proportional representation, and they get excited about that too. And so that's just exciting, and we do see kind of overlap and potential shared growth in the movements for ranked choice voting and proportional ranked choice voting, and hoping and working towards more Portlands and more cities and maybe even a state
Yeah.
adopting proportional representation in the next few years.
Let me ask you this, and this will be my last question, Will. We started off with a conversation around a poll that showed 47% of respondents felt they were voting for the lesser of two evils. And we've also talked over the last 30 odd minutes about organizations and reforms that have been successful in implementing change. So if I'm one of those 47% and I'm sitting on the couch and I'm frustrated and I want to do something about it, what would you recommend?
So the very short answer is visit us at fairvoteaction.org. You can find a list of all of the state and or local partners in your area that are already working on advancing election reform. Dan, you talked about Rank the Vote. A lot of those organizations are built up from and working really closely with Rank the Vote too. What I will say, though, broadly, is this is a change that you can actually drive in your city or your county or your state. And we have seen people do this successfully. We have seen ranked choice voting grow from about 10 cities in 2016 to over 50 cities and counties in 2 states now. There are 8 times more people who live in places that use ranked choice voting than there were at that time. People who are feeling hopeless, who are feeling politically powerless, you can make change happen. You can make change happen from the ground up. You can be an example to and an example for your neighboring city, your neighboring state. It's a virtuous and kind of self-fulfilling cycle. The more reform wins, the more it keeps winning. And so I would just say there are things we can do. There's a playbook to win. This is a reform that can win. It's a great opportunity to get involved and actually make some change and be the change you wish to see in starting to improve our democracy.
Very cool. So that is fairvoteaction.org. We will include a link in the show notes. Thank you very much, Will, for joining me on short notice. And we will find out if the listeners think that Sean loves frogs.
If I had a write-in, I would have guessed that he was ice fishing.
Oh!
Yeah.
Okay,
we're
going to include the write-in. You're a lot nicer than I am. I had him like in jail and eating Tide Pods. So yeah, we'll include that. You've got a fourth option, listener. And that is our show. Thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard today, please be sure to rate this episode, write a review, and share it with one person you think might like it too. Remember what Will said, in the right numbers, we can have a real impact. Be sure to check out fairvoteaction.org. I'll put the link in the show notes, as well as a link for you to tell me where you think Sean is. Theme music, courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you once again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.